federal Liberals gaining traction this Tuesday night. What a new poll reveals as the candidates hoping to replace Justin Trudeau hold their first English debate. Another premier suddenly ditches politics. Why Newfoundland and Labrador's Andrew Furey is quitting, and his parting shot at the U.S. president.
This guy is a maniac.
Indigenous leaders launch a landmark lawsuit against the RCMP.
It's prevalent throughout Canada.
The crisis the Mounties are accused of making worse. And the power of forgiveness, a grieving father's path to peace after one of this country's worst disasters.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with some big political news. Another Canadian premier is resigning. We'll get to that in just a moment. And we have some new polling that gives a snapshot of where federal political parties stand with Canadian voters. It reveals the Liberal Party has momentum and has overtaken the Conservatives. An Ipsos poll conducted for Global News over the weekend asked if a federal election were held tomorrow, which of the following parties' candidates would you be most likely to support? Among decided voters, 38% of respondents said they'd vote Liberal, 2 points ahead of the Conservatives at 36%. 12% said they'd support the NDP, and a strong majority, 86%, believe an election should be held immediately to establish a mandate to take on President Trump's tariff threat. The federal Liberals need to replace Justin Trudeau first. That leadership campaign is underway, and tonight the contenders are holding a debate in English after the French debate last night. David Akin is covering the debates for us. David, let's talk first about that poll. It's only one, and we take polls with a grain of salt. We're not in an election campaign yet, but what do you make of it?
Well, Donna, that poll is consistent with several other polls that we've seen ever since Justin Trudeau said that he would step down. That was really the first event that got the numbers moving. The second event is Donald Trump and his belligerence, his talk of the 51st state. That has a lot of Canadians wrapping themselves in the flag. And the third thing here is the arrival on the political scene of Mark Carney. All three of those things, Carney, Trump, and Trudeau, have got a lot of Canadians taking a look at their political leadership and making some choices now that are different than ones that they might have made 6 months ago. The Liberals are benefiting from that. The two parties that are really hurting, the New Democrats, they've lost a lot of support to the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois as well. But in this poll from Ipsos, we're also seeing that there's a small percentage of people who were ready to vote for Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives 6 weeks ago, and they're now looking at the Liberal Party. The four candidates vying to be the next leader of the Liberal Party and, by definition, the Prime Minister, all know that job one, if they win, will be protecting Canada from a belligerent Donald Trump, and each is making their pitch to Liberal voters with that in mind.
Men like Donald Trump have always underestimated leaders like me, but they underestimate me, and that's their mistake.
Trump is unleashed and empowered. As your Prime Minister, I will be too.
We can't change Donald Trump, but we can control our economic destiny.
Mr. Trump is a bully, and you do not give 1 inch to a bully.
Today's debate is the second and final debate of this quick campaign, which concludes March 9th. On Monday, the same quartet debated in French, the second language for all of them. For the perceived frontrunner, Mark Carney, it was a struggle. He had trouble at times understanding the questions and made at least one serious error. Translation? We agree with Hamas. The Conservatives immediately jumped on Carney for that misfire, even though other candidates immediately corrected him. And he clarified what he said after the debate.
I said that we all were in agreement against Hamas, or at least the intention.
Nonetheless, the view among French-language journalists and commentators was unanimous. While Carney's rivals were okay in French, Carney himself is not ready for prime time in both official languages.
It's a concern for the Liberals in terms of how he might perform on the same stage as other party leaders in a Francophone debate.
Now, will these debates make a difference? We're going to see, but there are nearly 400,000 Liberals registered to vote, and Donna, they can start casting a ballot tomorrow.
David Akin in Montreal tonight. Thanks. The Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador surprised everyone today. Andrew Furey is stepping down after being in office for almost 5 years. Furey, who is an orthopedic surgeon, says he never intended to be a career politician and that the all-consuming job has taken a toll on him and his family. And now that he's on his way out, Furey had some blunt words about what it's like dealing with the U.S. president, which he says is a factor in his decision. Heidi Petracek reports.
I'm eternally grateful for your support.
It was a sudden and shocking announcement from the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. Andrew Furey says he's stepping down.
I started my campaign with the admission to each and every one of you that I am not a career politician.
After careful consideration, he said it's all about bowing out at a time that makes sense for his family and the future stability of the province.
I feel that what we have accomplished together will no doubt be a rock-solid foundation for our province.
The news gobsmacking to folks on the streets of St. John's, a people not often lost for words.
I'm surprised. I mean, everybody's resigning nowadays.
Furey became Liberal leader and Premier of the province in turbulent times during the COVID-19 pandemic. An orthopedic surgeon before he was a politician, Furey used his experience as a physician to guide the province through the pandemic, heading from that into the healthcare challenges that came from COVID-19, addressing physician shortages, part of his mission.
Crazy.
Then there was the devastation left behind on the island from Hurricane Fiona in 2022. And the more recent historic Memorandum of Understanding with the province of Quebec over the power generated at Churchill Falls. Just last week, Prince Edward Island's Premier also stepped down in a surprise move, also citing family as the reason to back away from politics. But Furey also pointed to the turbulence of Donald Trump as a reason to put politics behind him, describing the American president as only a Newfoundlander can.
I mean, it's clear, right? Like, the guy's cracked.
I completely understand, Premier Furey's decision not to enter into a second term, right? Like, in these conditions, if this isn't what he wants to do.
Furey's Liberals won a slim majority government back in 2021, and the next provincial election was supposed to happen this November. Newfoundland and Labrador's Liberals now have to focus on finding a new interim leader and premier before then. Donna.
Okay, Heidi Petracek, thank you. In the face of Trump's threats, Nova Scotia's premier is trying to encourage interprovincial trade. Tim Houston introduced legislation today aimed at opening up more trade opportunities within Canada.
We're all working collectively to still trying to avoid a tariff situation, but also at the same time be prepared for one should it happen.
Premier Houston says the legislation will allow any goods made in other parts of Canada to be sold in Nova Scotia without further testing or extra red tape. It would also allow regulated professions such as healthcare professionals and skilled tradespeople to travel and work in other provinces. Houston wants other provinces and territories to follow suit and says provisions will only be extended to those that adopt similar legislation. In 1 week, if President Trump sticks to his threat, a 25% tariff will be imposed on Canadian imports to the U.S. Canadian diplomats are still trying to head it off. They held what they call Canada Day in Washington today. It showcased Canada's efforts on border security and fentanyl trafficking, which President Trump has demanded Canada improve.
We're doing everything we can to demonstrate the degree to which Canada is delivering on really important border improvements, and that's what's within our control. So we're doing everything within our control.
Canadian officials say the response from American lawmakers behind closed doors has largely been positive, but they acknowledge it is President Trump who makes the final call, and he has said those tariffs are going ahead. Two of Canada's biggest banks are reporting higher than expected earnings despite the uncertainty around North American trade. The Bank of Montreal earned more than $2 billion in the first quarter of this year. That's up from $1.3 billion over the same period last year. The profits driven by wealth management and capital markets. That revenue rose to nearly $9.3 billion. And despite Scotiabank reporting a drop in first quarter earnings, that bank's revenue rose to roughly $9.4 billion. A First Nation in British Columbia is taking on the RCMP, suing the force for failing to protect their people. The Heiltsuk Tribal Council claims drug dealers and other dangerous people are being emboldened because the RCMP refused to enforce laws on reserve lands. And they say it's an issue across the country. Chrystia explains the lawsuit and the broader policing challenges facing Indigenous communities.
In a first-of-its-kind lawsuit, the Heiltsuk First Nation is putting the RCMP on notice.
If the RCMP is not going to do it, we'll have to find ways to do it ourselves.
The suit filed in BC Supreme Court alleges the RCMP violated the Charter of Rights, failing to enforce the First Nations bylaws on reserve lands on BC's Central Coast.
And it creates fear, it creates distrust, it creates a feeling of helplessness.
Elected Chief Marilyn Slett says their community is experiencing a public safety crisis fueled by violence and drug addictions, and claims it's being exacerbated by the RCMP's inaction for failing to arrest drug dealers, trespassers, and violent offenders. Community leaders have created bylaws in hopes of widening the net when it comes to catching criminals, a strategy they say has worked on non-Indigenous communities, but not for them. None of the claims have been proven in court. At the heart of it, Chief Slett says, is racism.
Racism and discrimination within the RCMP is systemic.
Indigenous leaders say the problem is pervasive and this lawsuit is a last resort.
It's prevalent throughout Canada, and other First Nations face the same problems that we have with enforcing bylaw.
Our people, deserve to be treated equally, with any other community.
This lawsuit adds to the pile of concerns raised by First Nations leaders about the quality of service they get from the RCMP. In response, the Assembly of First Nations renewed calls late last year for more First Nations police forces.
I thought we were moving towards a good path on that, but of course there's chaos in the House of Commons and that can slow things down, and that worries me.
In response, the RCMP says its detachment managed more than 800 files last year and is committed to addressing safety and security concerns. Chrystia, Global News, Vancouver.
Alberta's infrastructure minister has resigned from the cabinet of Premier Danielle Smith, saying he lacks confidence in the government's procurement practices. Peter Guthrie says he voiced concerns over Alberta's procurement practices across all departments. In a statement, he says, "I had line of sight into these processes and took steps to address inconsistencies and recommend improvements." He says he's stepping down because the majority of cabinet does not appear to share my concerns. Earlier this month, Guthrie urged Premier Smith to remove the health minister from her post over allegations of government interference surrounding overpriced health deals. The progressive views of Pope Francis. Coming up, the barriers he broke and the anxiety over losing the advancements he made. Catholics around the world are anxiously waiting for word on Pope Francis. The Vatican says he had a follow-up CT scan this afternoon to check on the infection in his lungs. There is no indication his condition has deteriorated further, and he was able to carry out church business from his hospital bed this morning. Jeff Semple is in Rome for us. Jeff.
Donna, the Vatican said tonight that the Pope's condition remains critical but is now stable, and concerns for his failing health reach far beyond the Catholic Church.
In Rome, it's known as Gay Street, home to the city's LGBTQ community, a place used to shaking things up. In the shadow of the Vatican, Italy's gay community has a difficult history with the Catholic Church. But under Pope Francis, that relationship improved.
I feel safe in Rome at the moment with the Pope.
Despite making some controversial comments, Pope Francis has welcomed the LGBTQ community into the church, allowing priests to bless same-sex unions, hosting transgender people for a Vatican luncheon, and extending invitations for rituals such as baptisms.
It felt like, no, we want you to actually be here.
Max Kuzma met the Pope last year as part of a group of transgender Catholics.
To be able to meet the person who is at the top of the organization as your true self, that in and of itself, I think, was probably one of the most meaningful things to me.
But he fears the Pope's progress could all be undone.
A lot of anxiety and concern about what happens to the Catholic Church should Pope Francis pass away, especially really in light of the political situation in the United States.
The Trump administration is curtailing protections for diversity and LGBTQ rights, while far-right parties are gaining momentum in Europe. But the Pope has pushed back.
Very interesting that the most progressive leader on the world stage today is the Pope in Rome. I mean, who would have thunk?
Francisco is so different from the others.
This activist organized Rome's first ever Pride Parade 30 years ago. She fears Francis will be replaced by a traditional conservative.
It's a very hard moment. I hope that he survives.
The Vatican says the Pope is now feeling well enough that he's actually catching up on paperwork. He blessed a number of new saints and appointed some new archbishops, including one in the city of Vancouver. Donna?
Jeff Semple in Vatican City, thanks. Defense spending boost ahead. The UK ramping up its military budget in the face of Russian aggression. There are multiple reports Ukraine and the U.S. have agreed on a deal over Ukraine's critical minerals. It's reported Ukraine has agreed to turn over revenue from some of its mineral resources to the U.S. after intense pressure by President Trump to get Ukraine to pay back the U.S. for its financial and military help in the fight against Russia. Trump has insulted and threatened Ukraine's president, and Trump claimed again today that Volodymyr Zelensky could travel to Washington to sign the deal with him this week. Britain's Prime Minister calls Russian aggression a dangerous new era, and he is boosting the UK's military budget. He's announced the UK will increase defense spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. And he's doing it just before he heads to Washington to also meet President Trump. Vincent McAviney reports.
British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer will be the second European leader to travel to Washington this week, as uncertainty grows about US ties to Europe and Ukraine. President Trump has long been a critic of fellow NATO members not spending enough on defence. So today, Starmer preempted his visit with an announcement.
This government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so we reach that level in 2027.
Pulling the money from the foreign aid budget, that amounts to roughly an extra 24 billion Canadian dollars per year on defence, putting the UK near the top of NATO spenders. But there are still several in the alliance, like Canada, Italy and Spain, not spending the required 2% minimum, something Starmer highlighted as he pledged to go further to 3% in the next decade.
I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence.
But analysts aren't so sure it'll be that easy.
The UK has really sort of had to be dragged a bit kicking and screaming even to this modest uplift announced today. So the idea that sort of one stern or awkward conversation with Donald Trump might suddenly send the UK up to 3.5%, for example, starts to look a bit tricky.
For Britain, providing defence and security guarantees is seen as a way of repairing relations after the tumultuous Brexit years. Today's announcement might help charm Trump, but it's also recognition that Europe is entering an uncertain new era without guaranteed American support. Vincent McAviney, Global News, London.
In South Korea, at least 4 people are dead and 6 others injured after a highway overpass collapsed. This is the moment it happened. The overpass in a city about 80 kilometers south of Seoul was under construction at the time. Rescuers are still searching for survivors. Next, a father's grace in the face of unimaginable grief. We often note the deaths of well-known people, but tonight we're taking a moment to remember someone who wasn't famous. He is a father from Quebec who is remarkable for the grace he showed dealing with the loss of his daughter in one of the greatest tragedies in modern Canadian history. Mike Armstrong wanted to tell his story. Mike.
Well, Donna, this is a man who had every reason in the world to be angry. Instead, Jean Clusio chose forgiveness, and he leaned into it. when a runaway crude oil train rolled into Lac Mégantic in July of 2013. The explosions and fire killed 47 people, among them 24-year-old Kathy Chrystia. She'd been at home sleeping. The coroner would tell her father Kathy died in the street, trying to escape her apartment after the first explosion, killed by the one that followed.
Kathy just got enough time to go outside, but just a breath, and in 5 seconds, it was all over.
Now, 3 men were tried for their roles in what went wrong, including the driver who'd parked the train at the top of the hill. He'd left it with mechanical problems and hadn't set enough handbrakes. Hearing the details in court was painful for Chrystia, but he said he wanted to understand everything.
I missed one day in all the trial.
Now, the easy thing for Chrystia to have done, and it would have been understandable, would have been to be angry. He chose instead, he would say, serenity. There were moments like this where the accused would leave court, and Chrystia, with a handshake, would make it clear he had chosen forgiveness.
Sometimes I had some question to ask him. And
he answers?
Yeah. He's a very a good gentleman. I can assure you of that.
Chrystia thought of Kathy every day for the rest of his life, but his focus instead became his other daughter, Kim, and then a grandchild, and then another. I remember being nervous approaching Monsieur Chrystia at first. Eventually, he reached out as a Facebook friend. It was always nice to see his updates and get his comments and to be reminded of the kind of people that are out there. Donna?
And we need more reminders of that. Our thoughts are with his family. Thank you, Mike. That is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Nicola Lake in BC's Thompson Okanagan. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to globalnational@globalnews.ca. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.